regulators, but also with the private sector, and specifically include financial institutions, DNFPPs, and NGOs, and of course, the victims themselves, so that timely changes can be made with regard to the money laundering, terrorist financing risk landscape, which can be shared to mitigate human trafficking and other crimes. As a transnational crime, it is important that financial intelligence generated by FIUs on modern slavery and human trafficking is shared with domestic and international competent authorities. Thus, collaboration with international stakeholders such as Egmont, FinCEN, and FINTRAC, as a few examples, and regionally with CARICOM Impacts, the RSS ARU, which is an asset recovery unit, and ARIN Carib, is crucial. The interagency collaboration at the regional and international level facilitates more effective financial investigations, leading to prosecutions and convictions of persons for modern slavery and human trafficking. A typical human trafficking case discussed at our recent CFATF plenary meeting involved collaboration between police officers, the FIU, customs, immigration, social services, foreign law enforcement, counterparts, financial institutions, and translators. And of course, included that in that group was actually communication with the victims, understanding what they went through, the process, how they got to be there, because as I said, there are many avenues and channels of luring people and misusing them and misusing their labor and services. Given the ongoing fluidity and uncertainty associated with the pandemic, the ingredients for increased human trafficking and exploitation of workers remains high, and so risk mitigation measures that can be built into financial transactions are essential. While some of the proceeds of human trafficking may be unbanked, it is believed that most transactions flow through financial institutions as legitimate financial services businesses. The significant increase in virtual or online transactions that involve non-face-to-face encounters as a result of the pandemic also means that red flags such as high levels of cash deposits and fund transfers received from individuals and deposits and withdrawals at ATMs bear less significance in suspecting that human trafficking or modern slavery is taking place. In the area of strengthening financial investigations, the FAST Blueprint recommends the development of transaction analysis tools. As mitigating measures, financial institutions can therefore target scenarios which appear to be human trafficking related through customer profiling and their related transactional activity. The use of advanced data analytics, which builds upon keyword searches, can be used to help categorize different types of human trafficking scenarios. For example, with words such as escort service or massage parlor indicating a trafficker scenario, and travel words such as hotel, motel, or even Uber may indicate victim scenarios. This feeds into identifying suspicious transactions that involve human trafficking and the submission of detailed suspicion transaction reports to FIUs that can lead to financial investigations. The FATF paper on financial flows from human trafficking also suggests, among other things, that greater focus be placed on Hawala-type systems and their use by facilitators to ensure that there is greater traceability of the financial flows of human trafficking. The review of red flag indicators to address the increased use of online financial services and the training of persons in the financial transaction chain on the risk indicators of human trafficking and modern slavery are also good ways to mitigate the risk through financial institutions. In concluding, the important takeaway is the need for ongoing collaboration by public and private sector stakeholders and victims to facilitate financial investigations that can lead to ending the chain of misery that is caused by modern slavery and human trafficking. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you so much, Dawn, for again reminding us the importance of financial investigations based on financial intelligence, and with that underlying the importance of collaborating with the private sector here, but also because we deal here with a transnational crime to highlight the relevance of international cooperation. You were mentioning the Egmont Group. I was very happy to see that the chair of the Egmont Group is actually among us here. Hi, Henny. The Egmont Group, along with many other FIUs, some of them mentioned by Dawn, play a fundamentally important role to detect human trafficking and modern slavery in the transactions. But also thanks, Dawn, for mentioning that we have to keep being very attentive to recent changes. So red flags indicators that have been identified a few years ago may not have the same importance as they have now. So I think that's more than a valid point. Thank you very much, Dawn.
You're welcome.
We now turn to James Kofi Annan. James is the founder of a non-profit, non-governmental organization in Ghana that works to protect children's rights and end child trafficking. James was trafficked when he was 6 years old, and he spent 7 years there in modern slavery. He managed to escape, returned to his home, and put himself through school. Later, while working as a bank manager, James saved up money to start Challenging Heights, with the intent to prevent more children from going through what he did and to rescue the children still working on Lake Volta. James was also a member of the Financial Sector Commission on Modern Slavery and Human Trafficking. James, great to have you with us, and please, the floor is yours for the next minutes. I think you are unmuted. You are muted, James. Here we are.
Okay. Thank you very much, Daniel, and great to see you again. And good everyone. Fiona, it's nice seeing you again. I think the last time we met was in France when we attended the PRI conference. Is it France or somewhere in Europe? But it's great always listening to you speak about the issues that you work on. And I'm pleased to say that you have taken a portion of some of the issues that I think is very important to have our audience listen to. And that is the issue of increased vulnerability and the worsening numbers of children who have become victims of child labor and child trafficking. So quite easier now. I'll just look at the how COVID-19 is impacting on victims or survivors, and how we can build sustainably with them. When we look at what has happened, especially in our parts of the world, we see that a lot of our economy is dependent on person to person, and not so much of huge technology injection as far as the
James, I'm afraid you're breaking up
is concerned. So right when
James, you're breaking up occasionally.
Internet.
James, I suggest that can you please try maybe to switch off your video camera? Because you're breaking up, and that may improve the audio.
Yes, it's the internet. I'm sorry. Is it better now?
Try again.
Hello? Is it better now?
James, try again. I think we
Hello,
can
Daniel?
hear you. Yes, we can hear you. Please move on.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, sure. Thank you. So, in other parts of the country, as had been mentioned already, in other parts of the world, governments, when they rolled out stimulus packages, most of it were done into the account of the citizens, and the citizens were able to access their bank account with the ATM cards or with their credit cards or with their debit cards, and they were able to purchase items online and to be delivered to them directly in their homes, etc., etc. In our part of the world, that was not the case. So stimulus packages in Africa mainly had to do with handout, that monies were supposed to be delivered physically to the citizens, and food were supposed to be delivered physically to citizens. That meant that a lot of those who were already excluded from the financial system, who did not have access to technological products such as ATM cards and debit cards and credit card, could not access these. Government could not send these monies or these stimulus packages through their account because they were excluded. And of course, government needs to be accountable to the people, and therefore government to people that will not have records about it, and so on and so forth. So victims of modern slavery and human trafficking who were already vulnerable and who, by nature of their vulnerability, were not able to access some of these technological facilities, were further made vulnerable by this, pandemic, which made them unable to access a lot of stimulus packages. And of course, once this is an organized crime, victims became even more vulnerable because who were supposed to provide protection for them and who were supposed to be able to address their issues could not do so because of the restrictions. And so victims who were already vulnerable with their traffickers had to stay with their traffickers as long as the restrictions lasted. We also know that a lot of businesses closed down, and already survivors of human trafficking most of them had no job, and once businesses closed down, then they were going to face more vulnerability as far as COVID impact was concerned. But more importantly, I know that globally, once you have access to banking and once you have access to some technological platforms such as money, mobile money, and so on and so forth, then you can sit in the comfort of your home and. But here's the case: we are looking at a group of people who do not have mobile phones, who do not have identification cards, and those who do not have any service. Because as you know, most of these survivors live or are from vulnerable communities and are from poor communities, and therefore they live from hand to mouth. They don't have savings, and they don't have some of these platforms that we are talking about, and therefore, once the lockdown was announced, they instantly became very, very extremely vulnerable. In Ghana here, as my organization did, we had to work with our partners to be able to access some grants and be able to give some physical cash grant to survivors of human trafficking and their families so that they will be able to live on. But you're talking about thousands who needed help but who could not access help because of the particular nature of their vulnerabilities. So a lot of traffickers ended up acting on behalf of their victims or acting on behalf of survivors because they are the ones that they know, and they are the ones who hold ID cards and who have access to bank accounts and who have access to technological platforms. Even in the government stimulus package that was sent to them, still you find some traffickers going to take the packages on behalf of survivors, thereby further impoverishing them and further making them vulnerable. the issue of human trafficking and its aggravation in the face of the COVID pandemic, it needs to be addressed holistically and sustainably. And I believe that it is partnership that will ensure I will do my part, you do your part, government will do its part. But we would have to all get a pass together in order that survivors will be protected and will get justice for what they are going through. Thank you.
Thank you so much, James, for again sharing this important perspective from the Global South to the conversation we're having. I mean, we have been speaking about the effects COVID-19 had, but hearing it from you and in the local context, it makes it even more shocking. It also shows again how important access to basic financial services is essential to protect vulnerable populations, but also how challenging this can be, especially among poor populations. We continue to work with you, James. I hope we can continue to work with you and other survivors, which is a fundamentally important component of the FAST initiatives, and we are very privileged to have your views and your insight, which is very much actually driving our agenda. Let me just remind everyone that we have a Q&A functionality here, so please submit your questions before we move on to the next intervention. And during the next intervention, because the next part will be the Q&A part, I'm sure you have some questions. You can either direct them to one panelist or just to all of us, and then we will see who can provide the answer. But last but certainly not least, I now have the pleasure to give the floor to His Excellency Carlos Ruiz Gonzalez. He is Ambassador at Large for Human Trafficking and also Deputy Director General for International Cooperation Against Terrorism, Drugs and Organized Crime of the Spanish Ministry of Foreign Affairs. As you have heard from the introductory remarks, Spain is very committed to combat modern slavery and human trafficking, also by mobilizing finance. Carlos, great to have you with us. Thank you for joining us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Daniel. It's a pleasure to be here with you from Madrid. Your Excellence, Permanent Representative, dear colleagues, experts on human trafficking. I first of all would like to thank the UNU Center for Policy Research and precisely the FAST initiative for your kind invitation to participate as a panelist in this side event. After the political commitment to fight modern slavery and human trafficking assumed by the ministers of Spain and Liechtenstein, former Minister of Spain, because as you said it before, Daniel, there was a reshuffle last Saturday. Well, and all the highly interesting contributions of my fellow panelists, I am absolutely positive that practical conclusions will be drawn from this interesting event. As my former minister pointed out, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, the rise of modern slavery and human trafficking already gave cause for concern. And while we all heard that the 2016 estimate that a staggering 40 million people were trapped in modern slavery, and various indicators pointed to a surge in these forms of exploitation over the last decade. But then COVID pandemic came, and poverty and unemployment left millions of people across the world in a deeply vulnerable state. Marginalized populations felt the economic impact of the pandemic the hardest, which disproportionately affected women and girls, while child labor continued to scale. The ILO report mentioned before my minister predicts that approximately 9 million more children could be forced into child labor by the end of 2022 due to the pandemic. And these figures are often hard to put into perspective, but that would be the equivalent to the 8th most populous country in the world. In addition to the lack of social and economic opportunities during the pandemic, the disruption to assistance and anti-slavery programming, together with the expanded use of technology for exploitation and enticement and a more limited law enforcement capacity, in many countries have had a cascading effect on vulnerability to these forms of exploitation. Criminal groups, including human trafficking networks, prey on those most vulnerable during a humanitarian crisis. And in that sense, the COVID-19 pandemic has been no exception. Some human rights organizations saw a 185% increase in the number of reports of trafficking these days. Nevertheless, and as you have heard during the minister's intervention, this grim picture has come with a growing recognition of the action needed to address modern slavery and human trafficking, as some of my fellow panelists have also outlined before me. The existence of modern slavery and human trafficking in supply chain means that some businesses compete on an uneven playing field. So the financial sector in particular has an important role to play in supporting good faith business actors. This is the reason why the Liechtenstein initiative is so important, because it can put together people and institutions from both the private and the public sectors, meaning regulators, financial institutions, victims and survivors, political leaders, or civil society organizations, to build on new ideas and good practices that all the stakeholders can put into real practice afterwards. We are all aware that financial institutions do come in touch with modern slavery and human trafficking generated funds, since traffickers want to transform those illegal revenues into legal ones. On the other hand, financial institutions may provide services of funds to companies or people associated to those crimes. The question is whether the financial sector is doing all it can and must to comply with all international and domestic legislation to counter modern slavery and human trafficking. Are they truly trying? It's a fact that during the pandemic, all the investors' eyes have been on social risk in environmental, social, and governance criteria, and ESG investing continues to grow with sustainable finance strategies that incorporate labor exploitation risks. In addition, asset managers around the world have come together to work in collaboration with businesses to rid value chains of modern slavery. Never has the S in ESG had as much attention as it does today, as Fiona noted previously. Financial investigation, aided by advances in financial technology, are further strengthening indicators of illicit financial flows of these forms of exploitation to detect and disrupt criminal networks. Moreover, regulators are further strengthening anti-money laundering and corporate reporting requirements. New developed indicators and toolkits, thanks to extensive bank data analysis, will largely improve the identification of those risks, although its effectiveness remains to be proved. That is why many experts indicate that taking into account survivors' experiences could be very useful in helping financial institutions identify where and how they might interact with potential businesses. Our dear friend and expert James Cockney explained this issue very clearly in a fast briefing paper in 2018. And I mention this because I believe that the interaction among financial institutions, public sectors, and survivors should be strengthened, not only from a prevention, but also from a compensation point of view. Moreover, not only the private sector is strengthening its instruments in order to detect and eradicate modern slavery and human trafficking practices from its portfolio, but also governments throughout the world are trying to increase the transparency legislation, creating due diligence frameworks in order to better struggle against human trafficking. Recognizing the grave personal and societal damage that modern slavery and human trafficking cause, governments are also increasingly coming together with the private sector to take multilateral collective action, as laid out 10 years ago in the UN Guiding Principle on Businesses and Human Rights. And the FAST initiative is a testament to that, and it is the reason why Spain is increasingly committed with it. We know that no one can end modern slavery and human trafficking on their own. Therefore, it is essential that we collaborate to find solutions that work, especially those that support survivors and those groups most vulnerable to exploitation. The COVID-19 crisis has exposed the fragilities in global supply chains and its tangible human costs. The pandemic has also given us all an opportunity to identify and implement the strategies to create systems that are more resilient for the future. Now is a crucial time to lay the foundations of a more global, inclusive economy to meet our shared objectives of the 2030 Agenda on Sustainable Development. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen from Madrid. I think these discussions and your attentions are very grateful from you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. Also, by giving this discussion a positive note, by clearly admitting the challenges that we are facing, but also identifying opportunities in that situation, and certainly resilience is probably the key word that should come to our mind, and we have to rethink the way we have done work in the past and move on in that regard. Thank you so much, Carlos, also for being with us here and supporting our work. We move on to the questions and answers round now, and I'm very happy to see that we have received a number of questions. Let me start with Andrew Dalip's question. He says that any access to financial services by the vulnerable populations is a tool to safeguard against human trafficking and modern slavery. And he was wondering, how does the panel anticipate international standards on financial inclusion to evolve in response to this issue? And I was wondering, Dawn, if I could start with you. You are part of the group that creates and implements international standards, whether you would like to elaborate on this question.
Thank you, Daniel, and thank you, Andrew, for the question. Yes, it's definitely important for everyone to change the way we do business and the way we address things. And the FATF, of course, has recognized that there are somewhat unintended consequences, as they say, and there's an ongoing project in terms of looking at the impact that the FATF recommendations have on aspects such as financial exclusion, the risking, which is another side of the coin, depends on which angle you look at it, and some of the other measures that they put in place and how they can address those in a manner that allows, of course, everyone to improve their AML, CFT, CPF frameworks, but at the same point in time, give credence to the fact that there are some negative fallout that can be harmful to countries. So I think that that is going to play an important part in how we look at this. Human trafficking and is high on the agenda in terms of a predicate offense for the FATF. They have a recent paper that was done in 2018. There's ongoing work, even at the CFATF level. We are looking at financial flows from human trafficking and smuggling of migrants. It's a growing problem, again, because of COVID-19, shifting populations, people trying to go from where things are bad to where they hope they're better, whether they're being lured legitimately or not. So certainly it is a matter that is being looked at and something that has to be focused on, not only by the FATF, but by everyone, financial institutions, in terms of finding ways so that further populations, further amounts of people, larger amounts of people are not excluded because of the financial situation and because of COVID. Thank you, Daniel.
Thanks a lot, Dawn. And yes, indeed, I mean, first and foremost, we have to ensure that existing international standards do not impact negatively on financial inclusion. And the work of the FATF is very welcome. I think the German presidency should also be commended for having started that work. For a long time, it was a difficult conversation that we were having, and I think this analysis will help us to move on. Whether or not from that point on international standards will evolve to ensure financial inclusion remains to be seen. We have seen a lot in the European Union happening with mandatory access to basic financial services, which is good. Whether this will then be expanded to other parts of the region remains to be seen. Certainly, if we do that, we have to be very mindful of different circumstances and what works in the north and in the west doesn't necessarily work in the global south. So we have to be mindful of what we do and where. There's been a question directly addressed to Fiona, so I hope I don't put you on the spot, but you may have seen it already. And the question is, would you have inputs on how to best educate the financial sector actors on investing good attention and resources to the S in ESG? Fiona, do you want to contribute to that?
Yeah, sure. Well, I think in terms of good resources on the S issues, there's quite a lot on the PRI website that we have for investors in thinking about social issues more broadly, whether that's to do with issues like human rights. We've got a paper that's there and how investors can start incorporating these issues. Then we have them on a range of other social topics. And we've also got papers there that try to think about issues in a more holistic way. So even when we think about climate change, we still have to think about the social issues to do with climate. And there's quite a lot of social issues, both in developed and developed countries. And we have to take people along with us. So our website's www.unpri.org. And yeah, there's plenty of resources that are there, and they're all free to access as well.
Thank you very much, Fiona. Also on the FAST Initiative website, fastinitiative.org, you'll find useful information, including tools how to implement the goals. The first question, Charity Morsey asks, how do we provide incentives to the private sector? And I was wondering, James, you had your hand up, if you could speak on to this point.
Well, yes. Briefly, I think that the FAST initiative is already doing something to incentivize the financial sector to be proactive and to take action. The recent financial inclusion initiative that has many financial sector actors on it is making some financial sector organizations look in the eyes of their investors and in the eyes of their customers. So as more people enroll on it, they do so believing that apart from they addressing social issues, they are also doing so for their investors to know that they are taking action, in their communities and in their society. Also, you will see that the FAST initiative has developed a lot of tools, financial risk mapping tools, that there are some different levels of financial institutions and their levels of response to some of these risk issues. There are some who take risk as just a risk of lending and the potential of defaulting or the risk of money laundering and so on and so forth. But they do not take risk as a social issue, right issues in their lending practices and so on and so forth. And to give them these basic tools for these financial institutions to use, then give them, facilitate, or at least encourage them to start something. And once they go in there, they will be able to then build on what FAST initiative has provided, and then they can do more sophisticated risk tools that will follow the money and to know where the risks are. So these are two basic incentives that I believe that the FAST initiative is providing within the sector. Of course, there's more we are doing in order to incentivize these these sectors. And as time goes, I'm sure we'll continue to grow out our actions and we'll get more people on board.
Thanks a lot, James. This question on incentives for the private sector is a good one. It's also a bit a sad one, I must say. We're speaking here about ending one of the most atrocious crimes, and what could be a better incentive than contributing to ending this crime? But it's true, and we have seen another way of incentivizing private sector engagement was in the context of our Survivor Inclusion Initiative. If you need more information on that, please consult our website. But basically, in the Survivor Inclusion Initiative, we work both with support organizations as well as with financial institutions to help victims and survivors of the crime to get basic financial services, access to basic financial services. And we do showcase that. And very often financial institutions use their engagement in this initiative to make reference to it in their modern slavery statement. So that may also be seen as an incentive for financial institutions to participate. Finally, there was a question from an anonymous participant wondering about mandatory human rights due diligence reporting requirements. And question is relatively simple and straightforward. Do we think they are doing enough? And what would you want to see states including the mandatory human rights due diligence requirements to make them more effective? Again, maybe Fiona, do you want to kick off on that? And of course, others then are more than happy to complement.
Sure. Well, obviously, because of the state of modern slavery and human trafficking around the world, we can't say that anybody is doing enough. And mandatory human rights due diligence is needed across the world, and I think it has to be really the fundamental that everyone has to report. We have to, I think on the flip side of that is that we have to also be careful about some of the reporting about modern slavery and human trafficking, whether that's in modern slavery acts or whatever it might be. Because what we actually want is we want companies to find modern slavery, and we want them to report it, because once you've found it and you've reported it, you need to do something about it. And part of what we also need is to know, now that you've found something, what have you done about it? But there can be a situation where people try to. What I think I might have dropped out. Have I dropped out?
No, you're good. We can hear you.
Okay, sorry. Something came up on my screen and everyone disappeared. So we can have a situation where, of course, companies, investors are finding the situation of modern slavery and human trafficking, and then they're plastered all over the front page of every newspaper as being this being a terrible thing, which of course it is. But we need to actually celebrate the fact that they found it and that they're doing something about it, because from the work that we have done, we don't really believe that there's many multinational organisations out there that actually don't have some form of modern slavery and human trafficking in them. And I think the other issue is how far and deep do they go into their supply chains. So it's pretty easy to say, oh well, who's the first line of my outsourcing, and who do I outsource to, and just stop there. But we all know that there's outsourcing on outsourcing on outsourcing and outsourcing. So you really need to go down into quite a bit of depth on these issues and in those supply chains as well. So I'll let you add, sorry, Daniel, to that.
Thanks a lot. Very thoughtful. Like you, I'm far more concerned about large companies that have never ever identified a link to modern slavery, human trafficking.
They say they don't have it.
Exactly. And given the size of the problem, that's basically impossible. That means that turning a blind eye on it, and that is a thing. Indeed, and I think we have seen very often in the context of anti-money laundering that the financial institutions that have seen wrongdoing and have seen deficiencies are actually now improving their systems So there's nothing wrong to detect linkages to modern slavery and human trafficking, as long as you're committed to do something about it. And that's something we certainly want to support also from our side. Good, thank you very much so far. I'm now very happy to pass the floor to His Excellency Mitch Fifield, Permanent Representative of Australia to the United Nations. Australia has been supporting FAST since its inception a few years ago, and the Minister of Foreign Affairs and Trade has been a co-convener of the Financial Sector Commission. Your Excellencies, thanking for your presence. The floor is now yours.
Well, thank you so much, Daniel, and I know it's been a very busy day for you on a range of subjects, but great contributions. And can I firstly pass on the apologies of our Minister of Foreign Affairs and Minister for Women, Senator Marise Payne, who unfortunately wasn't able to take part in today's proceedings, but who follows these matters very, very closely. And I've got to say, it's been a real pleasure to hear such a terrific discussion. Thank you so much to all the panellists, and I think what we would say in Australia is that this has been an absolutely cracking panel. So thank you so much, everyone. As has been so well highlighted by our panellists today, the finance sector plays such an important role in addressing human trafficking and modern slavery. The sector, we all know, is integral to business operations, so any changes that financial actors make in their investment decisions or how they deliver financial services can have a very considerable impact on other industries. And that's why, for our part, Australia, together with Liechtenstein and the Netherlands, co-convened the Financial Sector Commission on modern slavery and human trafficking, and why we continue to be a leading supporter of the FAST initiative. In the last few years, Australia has been working to socialise the Commission's recommendations across the Indo-Pacific region, and we really have seen some very good success. In September last year, for example, the Bali Process Government and Business Forum, co-chaired by Australia and Indonesia, convened a session focusing on the finance sector. That session highlighted the considerable work already being done by many parts of the diverse sector, including investors, stock exchanges and pension funds as well. And in April, Minister Payne co-convened with her Spanish counterpart a meeting of women foreign ministers to discuss the gender implications of the COVID pandemic, with a special focus on the vulnerability of women and girls to trafficking. At the meeting, ministers endorsed the recommendations of the Blueprint report and discussed implementation in their respective regions. Ministers also discussed the importance of taking a victim-centred approach to make sure that victims and survivors are supported and that their experience really does inform our responses to modern slavery. We're pleased to see such a high level of commitment to the Blueprint, but as we've heard today, COVID does continue to challenge us in our efforts, and addressing the impacts of the pandemic will require a response that's built together with business, civil society and international partners. And that's why the FAST initiative is just so important, and why Australia remains committed to working with the finance sector to address this issue. And thank you again so much to all colleagues for their great participation today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Your Excellency. It's up to me now to thank all panellists today, Dawn, Fiona, James, Carlos, for joining us here, spending your precious time with us. Thanks to all our donors and partners of the FAST initiative, particularly to the Liechtenstein mission here in New York, Christian Beneweser and Sina Alavi for setting up this panel, and my dear colleague Anthony Dorsey at CPR, who is our visitor soon, who has helped us in the back to make us all come together here and that everything works very nicely on the technical level. I wish you all a very good day, and I'm looking very much forward to seeing you, hearing from you again at the next opportunity. Have a good day.
Recording stopped.